London, in that peculiar season when ambition glittered brighter than the chandeliers that illuminated it, possessed a talent for cruelty disguised as elegance. Beneath painted ceilings and beneath smiles polished to perfection, reputations were weighed, fortunes compared, and hearts wounded with such exquisite refinement that the injuries often passed unnoticed. On one such evening, while a late spring rain tapped softly against tall windows and 1,000 candles transformed crystal into liquid gold, a duchess learned how little mercy society offered to a woman already judged unworthy. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood near the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers lightly resting against an ivory fan she scarcely remembered carrying. Music drifted through the hall. Silk skirts whispered over marble floors. Diamonds flashed at pale throats like captive stars. Yet amidst all that brilliance she felt strangely invisible. Not because she lacked grace. Indeed, there was a quiet beauty about her that revealed itself gradually, as moonlight reveals a garden. Her eyes held warmth. Her smile carried sincerity. Her voice possessed a gentleness capable of calming frightened children and grieving servants alike. But London preferred spectacle. It preferred dazzling beauties, immense dowries, and women who entered a room like a declaration of victory. Eleanor entered rooms like a prayer. Across the ballroom, clusters of aristocratic ladies watched her with concealed amusement. "There stands the Duchess of Ravensshire," one remarked. "The fortunate bride." "Fortunate?" another replied softly. "One requires affection as well as a title." Their laughter vanished beneath the orchestra, yet Eleanor had long ago learned to recognize mockery without hearing every word. She lowered her gaze and offered a composed smile to a passing guest. Dignity, she had discovered, was often the final refuge of the wounded. At the far end of the hall stood her husband. Sebastian Ravensshire, Duke of Ravensshire, seemed carved from the very confidence that governed the age. Tall, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a commanding presence that turned conversations silent when he approached, he embodied everything society admired. Wealth followed him. Influence obeyed him. Admiration sought him. And yet there existed a distance about him more formidable than any castle wall. A year had passed since their marriage. A year since Eleanor had entered his vast estate carrying hope beneath her bridal veil. A year since Sebastian had placed a ring upon her finger with flawless courtesy and almost no visible emotion. Their union had been celebrated in newspapers and envied in drawing rooms. It had also been quietly questioned. She had not brought extraordinary wealth. She possessed no powerful political connections. Her family name was respectable rather than legendary. To many observers, the match appeared puzzling. To Eleanor it had once seemed miraculous. She had believed affection might grow. Perhaps not swiftly. Perhaps not dramatically. But steadily like roses climbing a stone wall. Instead, their marriage settled into polite distance. Sebastian never spoke harshly. He never humiliated her publicly. He fulfilled every duty expected of a husband. Yet he guarded himself so completely that she often felt she was living beside a portrait rather than a man. There were evenings when they dined together beneath glittering candlelight and exchanged fewer than 20 words. Still she loved him. Not because he made it easy. Because the rare glimpses beneath his reserve had captured her heart. A moment when he comforted an injured stable boy. A winter morning when she saw him leave food anonymously for a widow. A fleeting smile that transformed his severe features into something unexpectedly human. Those fragments sustained her. That night marked the first anniversary of their marriage. The celebration concluded shortly before midnight. Guests lingered over champagne and gossip while servants quietly cleared silver trays. Eleanor watched Sebastian from across the room. He appeared relieved that the formal obligations were ending. For one brief moment their eyes met. She thought she detected exhaustion there. Perhaps loneliness. The possibility lingered in her thoughts as he inclined his head and disappeared through a doorway leading toward the gentlemen's smoking room. Hope, even when repeatedly disappointed, can be remarkably persistent. Several minutes later Eleanor excused herself from a conversation and crossed the corridor beyond the ballroom. The noise of the celebration faded behind her. Ahead, warm lamplight spilled from beneath a partially open door. Voices emerged from within. Male voices. Relaxed. Amused. She recognized Sebastian's among them. At first she intended to continue walking. Then laughter erupted inside the room, followed by a familiar aristocratic drawl. "Come, Ravensshire," said one gentleman. "A year wet. Surely you can confess whether matrimony suits you." Another chuckled. "Or whether you regret it." More laughter followed. Eleanor paused. Not deliberately. Merely long enough for the next words to arrive. There was a brief silence. Then Sebastian laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. Not an angry one. That somehow made what followed infinitely worse. "Regret marrying her?" he said. The men waited. "My dear fellow," Sebastian continued lightly, "I regretted it the moment I signed the register." The room exploded with amusement. Outside the doorway, Eleanor stood perfectly still. The orchestra played on somewhere beyond the corridor. Rain tapped against distant glass. Inside her chest, something fragile and faithful quietly broke. For several seconds she neither moved nor breathed. The world retained its outward shape, yet its meaning had altered. Every kindness she had treasured suddenly seemed uncertain. Every silence acquired a sharper edge. She remembered waiting beside drawing-room fires for conversations that never came, defending him against whispered criticism, convincing herself that patience was another form of love. Now those memories rearranged themselves like shattered pieces of stained glass. No tears appeared. Eleanor had been raised too for public collapse. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped away from the door with measured grace. Anyone passing through the corridor would have seen only a composed Duchess returning from a celebration. No one would have guessed that the life she had spent a year protecting had ended between one laugh and the next. Dawn arrived beneath a curtain of silver rain, washing the sprawling Ravensshire estate in muted shades of gray. The great house, usually governed by routines as precise as a clockmaker's craft, awakened to confusion. Footmen exchanged worried glances. Maids hurried through corridors carrying whispers instead of breakfast trays. Something invisible had shifted during the night, and every servant felt it before anyone spoke the truth aloud. The Duchess was gone. At first, the discovery seemed impossible. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor's longtime lady's maid, had entered the Duchess's chambers shortly after sunrise expecting to assist her mistress with the morning routine. Instead, she found a room arranged with unusual care. The curtains had been drawn back. The hearth had burned low. A traveling cloak was missing from its stand. Most alarming of all, the bed had not been slept in. Within minutes, the household was searching. Servants combed the gardens, stables, carriage houses, and surrounding grounds. Grooms confirmed that one modest carriage had departed before dawn. The gatekeeper remembered seeing a veiled woman leave alone, though he had assumed it was done with permission. Only when Mrs. Whitmore discovered a folded letter resting upon Eleanor's writing desk did certainty replace confusion. The note contained merely a few lines. No accusations. No explanations. No dramatic farewell. Only gratitude for kindnesses received, apologies for inconveniences caused, and a final request that no one concern themselves with her whereabouts. The simplicity of the letter frightened them more than anger would have. Far below, in his private study, Sebastian Ravensshire listened as the house steward delivered the news. His expression remained unreadable. "You are certain?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace." "She left willingly?" "It appears so." Silence settled across the room. Rain tapped against tall windows. The steward waited for outrage, alarm, perhaps immediate orders. Instead, Sebastian rose and crossed toward the fireplace. "She will return," he said calmly. The steward bowed. "If that is your belief, Your Grace." It was not belief. It was assumption. Eleanor had always remained. Through loneliness. Through indifference. Through every carefully maintained distance. She had remained. Why would this be different? Yet as the morning progressed, an unfamiliar restlessness followed him through the estate like a shadow. He reviewed correspondence and failed to absorb a single sentence. He attended to financial matters and forgot figures almost instantly. By afternoon, he found himself standing outside Eleanor's chambers without consciously deciding to go there. The room felt strangely hollow. Not empty. Hollow. As though some quiet force that had animated it had been removed. He crossed toward the dressing table. There, untouched exactly where it had been delivered the previous evening, rested a velvet jewelry box. Sebastian opened it. Nestled within white satin lay a sapphire necklace of extraordinary beauty. Deep blue stones glimmered like fragments of midnight sky. His anniversary gift. He had commissioned it months earlier. Not from affection, perhaps, but from duty. From expectation. From the belief that generosity could compensate for emotional absence. Now it sat abandoned. He stared at the jewels for a long moment before closing the lid. His gaze drifted across the room. For the first time he began noticing things. A collection of books arranged carefully beside the window. Fresh flowers pressed between pages. Letters tied with ribbon. Small objects that had always existed yet somehow escaped his attention. He opened one volume. Neat handwriting filled the margins. Observations. questions, thoughtful reflections. The intelligence and sensitivity contained within those brief notes startled him. It felt strangely intimate, as though he were meeting his wife for the first time. Days passed. Eleanor did not return. The rain gave way to sunshine, but the estate remained unsettled. Then London began to talk. Society never allowed a mystery to remain untouched. Rumors spread through drawing rooms, clubs, and elegant luncheon tables with astonishing speed. Some claimed the Duchess had eloped. Others insisted she had suffered a nervous collapse. Still others suggested darker possibilities. Each version traveled farther than the truth. Newspapers soon joined the spectacle. Columnists transformed uncertainty into entertainment. The disappearance of a duchess proved irresistible. Every headline sharpened public curiosity. Every article invited fresh speculation. Sebastian endured it in silence. Yet the growing scandal forced him to confront questions he had carefully avoided. Why had she left? Why had she truly left? The answer waited in her rooms. One evening he discovered it accidentally. A senior housekeeper approached him carrying a ledger. "Your Grace," she said hesitantly, "I thought you ought to see this." The ledger contained records of charitable expenditures. Schools, widows, orphans, medical assistance. The amounts were modest individually but substantial collectively. Nearly all had been arranged discreetly through Eleanor. Anonymous donations, anonymous gifts, anonymous acts of kindness. For years, Sebastian turned page after page. The list seemed endless. "Why was I never informed?" he asked quietly. The housekeeper looked surprised. "Her Grace requested privacy." He lowered his gaze. Of course she had. Eleanor never sought applause. She had spent years improving lives without demanding recognition. The realization unsettled him more deeply than any newspaper scandal. That same week another blow arrived. At an influential gathering in Mayfair, a prominent duchess publicly remarked that Eleanor's departure reflected poorly upon her husband. The comments spread through aristocratic circles before nightfall. People began connecting fragments. A lonely wife, a distant marriage, a vanished duchess. For the first time, whispers followed Sebastian rather than Eleanor. He discovered that society, which once admired him without question, could be remarkably merciless when offered a fresh target. Yet public embarrassment was not what troubled him. The true wound emerged elsewhere. Late one night, unable to sleep, he returned once more to Eleanor's chamber. Moonlight spilled through the windows. The room stood silent, almost sacred. He opened a drawer he had never examined before. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in pale ribbon. Curious, he unfolded it. Pressed flowers slipped into his hand. Small, fragile blossoms carefully preserved between sheets of paper. Recognition struck instantly. They were flowers from their wedding day. A full year had passed. She had kept them all. Every single one. His chest tightened unexpectedly. He imagined Eleanor collecting them after the ceremony, saving them, protecting them, believing they mattered, believing the day itself mattered. The contrast between her devotion and his carelessness landed with devastating force. For the first time since her disappearance, certainty abandoned him. Perhaps she was not coming back. Perhaps the door he assumed would always remain open had finally closed. He stood motionless in the moonlit room, the dried flowers trembling slightly between his fingers, when a realization arrived with cruel clarity. He knew the size of her dowry. He knew the boundaries of her estates. He knew every detail society considered important. Yet he did not know where she would go when her heart broke. And as that truth settled over him, cold and undeniable, Sebastian Ravensheyer understood that finding his wife might require discovering who she truly was before he could ever hope to bring her home. The sea appeared first. After weeks of unanswered inquiries, abandoned trails, and frustrating silences, it emerged beyond the carriage window like a sheet of hammered silver stretching toward eternity. Gray clouds drifted low over the horizon. White gulls circled above jagged cliffs. Waves rolled against dark rocks with patient determination, as though the ocean itself understood that persistence eventually conquered even the hardest stone. Sebastian Ravensheyer sat motionless as the carriage descended toward the small coastal village. The investigator's report rested folded inside his coat pocket. A woman matching Eleanor's description. Living under another name. Teaching village children. Residing alone. The information was surprisingly simple considering how desperately he had sought it. Yet simplicity often carried its own weight. For nearly 2 months he had crossed between hope and despair. Every lead had dissolved. Every rumor had ended in disappointment. During those weeks, he had learned something society never taught powerful men. Regret was not passive. It pursued. It haunted. It followed a person into every room and sat beside them through every sleepless night. The village appeared untouched by the frantic ambitions of London. Stone cottages clustered beside narrow lanes. Fishing boats bobbed gently within a sheltered harbor. Laundry fluttered between buildings like small white flags surrendering to the wind. Life moved differently here. Slower. Kinder. Sebastian stepped from the carriage and immediately felt out of place. His tailored coat, polished boots, and aristocratic bearing belonged to another world entirely. No one recognized him. For perhaps the first time in years, his title carried no authority. The sensation was oddly humbling. Following directions provided by the investigator, he walked toward a modest schoolhouse overlooking the sea. Children's laughter drifted through open windows. He stopped. Then he saw her. Eleanor stood near the doorway surrounded by students carrying books and slates. The ocean breeze stirred loose strands of chestnut hair beneath her bonnet. Sunlight filtered through passing clouds, touching her face with soft gold. For several moments he simply stared. Not because she appeared dramatically transformed. Because she appeared peaceful. He had searched for a woman wounded by heartbreak. Instead he found a woman breathing freely. The realization unsettled him. A small boy tugged at Eleanor's sleeve. She laughed. The sound carried across the courtyard. Sebastian felt something twist painfully within his chest. He could not remember hearing that laugh during their marriage. Not once. The children eventually dispersed. Eleanor gathered several books and turned toward the path leading away from the school. Then she saw him. Everything stopped. The wind continued. The waves continued. Yet the space between them seemed suspended beyond ordinary time. Shock crossed her features. Not fear. Not anger. Neither moved. Neither spoke. A year earlier they might have appeared the perfect aristocratic couple standing together beneath crystal chandeliers. Now they stood as strangers separated by truths neither could ignore. Sebastian finally removed his hat. Eleanor. The sound of her name felt unfamiliar on his tongue. She remained still. Your Grace, she replied quietly. The formal title struck harder than any insult. He had spent weeks searching for her. Yet in that moment he understood distance could not be measured in miles. I would speak with you. A brief silence followed. Then she nodded once. There is a path above the cliffs. The walk unfolded beneath an overcast sky. Below them, waves shattered against rocks. Above them, gulls wheeled through cold currents of air. Neither spoke immediately. Too much remained unsaid. Eventually Eleanor stopped beside a weathered stone wall overlooking the sea. What do you wish to say? She asked. Sebastian studied her face. The same face that had once watched for signs of affection across countless dinner tables. The same face he had never truly learned to read. I wish to know whether you were safe. She looked toward the ocean. You crossed half the country to ask that? No. The honesty surprised them both. A faint tension entered her expression. Then why are you here? Because I miss you. Because I cannot sleep. Because every room feels emptier than it should. Because your absence has revealed the measure of my failure. None of those answers emerged easily. Instead he said the simplest truth available. Because silence became unbearable. Something flickered within her eyes. Not forgiveness. Recognition. She understood the cost of silence better than anyone. For years it had existed between them. A third companion seated at every meal. A ghost inhabiting every conversation. Eleanor lowered her gaze. You should return to London. I cannot. You can. No. The firmness of his answer startled her. For the first time she looked directly at him. Rain began falling. Only a few drops at first. Cold and scattered. What do you want from me? She asked. The question carried no hostility. Only exhaustion. Sebastian hesitated. Then the words arrived. The truth. A bitter smile touched her lips. At last? The rain intensified. Neither moved. Neither sought shelter. You wish for truth? She continued softly. Very well. I heard every word. He closed his eyes. Not because he did not understand. Because he understood perfectly. The smoking room. The laughter. The sentence that had followed him ever since. She had heard it all. Every syllable. Every careless note of amusement. When he opened his eyes again, she was watching him steadily. I stood outside the door, she said. You laughed. The memory felt uglier spoken aloud. I know. You regretted marrying me. His throat tightened. I said those words. Yes. The sea crashed below. Wind swept across the cliffs. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Eleanor continued, "You know what frightened me most?" He shook his head. It was not the cruelty. Her voice remained remarkably calm. It was realizing that I had spent an entire year loving a man who believed those words were true. The confession landed with devastating force. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Simply honest. Sebastian felt every defense he possessed begin to crumble. "I was wrong." The words emerged rough and unfamiliar. "You were." "I know." Another silence followed. Rain traced silver lines down his coat. "I thought duty was sufficient," he admitted. "I convinced myself that kindness without closeness was enough. I believed distance protected everyone." "Did it?" "No." The answer came immediately. For the first time since arriving, Eleanor's expression softened. Only slightly. Yet the change felt monumental. Not because forgiveness had arrived. Because honesty had. They stood together beneath the rain while years of misunderstanding lay exposed between them. Nothing was repaired. Nothing was resolved. Yet something had shifted. The first stone had been removed from a wall neither had managed to cross. As evening approached, Eleanor quietly excused herself and returned toward the village. Sebastian remained upon the cliffs watching her disappear along the winding path. He knew she had not forgiven him. He knew she might never return. Yet when he finally turned away, he noticed lights glowing from the schoolhouse windows below. The sight stirred a strange curiosity. Hours later, after darkness settled over the sea, he learned from a villager that an anonymous benefactor had recently offered funds to expand the struggling school. The proposal had arrived only that morning. And for reasons he could not entirely explain, Sebastian immediately knew exactly whose name would never appear upon the donation. The following morning dawned clear and luminous, the sea reflecting bands of pale gold beneath a sky washed clean by the previous day's rain. From the windows of the modest inn where he had taken lodging, Sebastian watched fishing boats venture into the harbor while gulls traced elegant circles overhead. The village stirred awake without urgency. No newspapers chronicled its concerns. No aristocratic expectations governed its rhythm. Life here seemed guided by necessity rather than appearance. For the first time in many years, Sebastian found himself envying simplicity. He remained in the village. Not because he believed Eleanor would suddenly forgive him. Not because he expected reconciliation. He stayed because leaving felt like another form of cowardice. Days passed. The villagers regarded him with cautious curiosity. Some recognized him as an outsider. Others simply knew he was the gentleman who often stood outside the schoolhouse long after classes had ended. He made no effort to explain himself. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued her work. She taught arithmetic, literature, and history to children whose families could afford little beyond determination. She visited widows, organized collections for struggling fishermen, offered comfort where she could. She moved through the village with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer required society's approval to measure her worth. Sebastian observed all of it, and each observation revealed another truth he had overlooked during their marriage. He had spent years assuming he understood her because he knew her circumstances. In reality, he had known almost nothing. One afternoon, while helping repair a damaged fence beside the school grounds, he noticed several workers unloading timber from a wagon. The headmaster approached him. "You have our gratitude, sir." Sebastian frowned. "For what?" "The funding." Understanding dawned immediately. Eleanor had discovered the anonymous donation. The headmaster smiled warmly. "The new classrooms will change everything." Sebastian glanced toward the school entrance. Eleanor stood there watching. Their eyes met briefly. No smile passed between them. Yet neither looked away. Something had changed. The hostility he feared had never truly existed. The deeper obstacle had always been disappointment. Trust, once fractured, demanded patience rather than persuasion. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Eleanor approached him for the first time without necessity forcing the encounter. "You purchased the school." It was not a question. "Yes." "Why?" Sebastian considered the answer carefully. "Because it matters to you." She studied him. "That is not enough reason." "It is now." A faint emotion crossed her face, difficult to name. Perhaps surprise. Perhaps sadness. Perhaps both. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sea whispered against the shore below. Golden light illuminated her features. "You never noticed what mattered to me before?" she said quietly. "No." The admission emerged without defense. "I did not." Her gaze lowered briefly. The honesty seemed to affect her more than excuses would have. Weeks earlier he would have justified himself, explained himself, protected himself. Now he simply accepted responsibility. The distinction mattered. Over the following weeks, an unexpected routine developed. They walked together occasionally. Not as husband and wife. Not even as friends. Rather as two people attempting to understand the distance that had once separated them. Their conversations remained cautious, yet increasingly sincere. Eleanor spoke of books she loved. Sebastian spoke of pressures he had never previously admitted. They discussed childhood memories, private fears, dreams abandoned long ago. Each conversation dismantled another layer of misunderstanding. One evening they paused atop the cliffs where their first difficult conversation had occurred. The sea stretched endlessly before them. Clouds glowed rose and amber above the horizon. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "Anything. Why did you truly marry me?" The question lingered between them. Months earlier he would have answered diplomatically. Now diplomacy felt dishonest. "My family needed stability," he said. "The estate required alliances. Your family offered respectability without political complications." The answer was painful. Yet she nodded. "I suspected as much." He continued. "At first I viewed marriage as an arrangement." "At first?" He looked toward the sea. "At first." Silence followed. Then Eleanor spoke softly. "You are not finished." "No." His voice tightened. "I am not." For several moments he struggled to continue. The admission waiting beneath the surface felt dangerously vulnerable. Finally he forced himself forward. "After you left, I began seeing evidence of your life everywhere." She listened quietly. The donations. The flowers. The letters. The kindness shown to servants. His gaze found hers. "You filled every room you entered with care." Emotion flickered within her eyes. "You never said that before." "I never understood it before." The confession settled heavily between them. Not dramatic. Not polished. Simply true. For the first time, Eleanor appeared unable to look away. A fragile warmth emerged where distance had once existed. Hope arrived cautiously. Like sunlight entering a long-closed room. Yet peace rarely survives unchallenged. Several days later, newspapers from London reached the village. The scandal exploded anew. Articles mocked the Duke of Ravensshire for abandoning aristocratic responsibilities in pursuit of his runaway wife. Editorials questioned his judgment. Members of his family sent increasingly urgent correspondence demanding his return. One letter proved particularly severe. His uncle accused him of humiliating generations of Ravensshire ancestors. Another warned that continued absence threatened political relationships. A third suggested that Eleanor was manipulating him. Sebastian burned each letter unread beyond the opening paragraphs. Word of his defiance spread rapidly. The village soon understood that one of England's most powerful men had chosen exile over expectation. Eleanor learned of it as well. "You should return," she told him one afternoon. "I will not. You may lose everything." His answer came immediately. "No." The certainty startled her. "You cannot mean that." "I do." "Why?" The question carried genuine confusion. Sebastian stepped closer. Not enough to crowd her. Only enough to remove the distance that had always existed between them. "Because everything I am supposed to value has already failed me." The words hung in the air. His title. His reputation. His pride. None had brought happiness. For years he had protected those things while neglecting the woman standing before him. At last he understood the cost. Dark clouds gathered above the sea that evening. Wind swept across the cliffs with increasing force. Rain threatened on the horizon. Yet neither moved. Neither retreated. The storm seemed strangely fitting. 4 years their lives had been governed by restraint. Now restraint was becoming impossible. "You once said you regretted marrying me," Eleanor whispered. Pain flashed across his features. "Yes." The memory remained unbearable. She looked directly into his eyes. "And now?" The question struck like lightning. No escape remained. No carefully measured answer would suffice. Only truth. The wind howled around them. Rain began to fall. Sebastian dropped to one knee in the wet grass, heedless of mud, rank, dignity, or consequence. The gesture shocked her into complete stillness. Looking up at the woman he had once taken for granted, he spoke with a raw sincerity she had never heard before. "The man who said those words deserved to lose you. But if there is any mercy left in this world, allow me one impossible privilege." Allow me the chance to spend the rest of my life proving he was wrong. Eleanor stared at him as thunder rolled across the darkening sea, and for the first time since leaving Ravensshire House, tears filled her eyes. The tears remained suspended in Eleanor's eyes long after the thunder faded across the sea. For a moment neither spoke. Rain drifted around them in silver curtains while the wind swept across the cliffs, carrying the scent of salt and distant storms. Sebastian remained kneeling before her, not as a duke commanding loyalty, but as a man stripped of every illusion he had once mistaken for strength. Eleanor stared at him, her heart torn between memory and possibility. The memory was easy. She remembered the loneliness, the silent dinners, the endless hoping, the cruel laughter beyond the smoking room door. Those wounds had shaped every mile of her journey away from Ravensshire House. Yet standing before her now was not the man who had spoken those words. Or perhaps he was. Perhaps he was simply the same man finally willing to face them. Slowly she extended her hand. Sebastian looked at it as though it were the most precious gift he had ever been offered. Then she placed her fingers in his. The gesture was small. The impact was enormous. A fragile bridge formed between two hearts that had spent years standing on opposite shores. Neither promised anything. Neither spoke of the future. Yet when they descended from the cliffs together, something long frozen had finally begun to thaw. The weeks that followed became the happiest either had experienced in years. Not because life suddenly became perfect. Because it became honest. For the first time, Sebastian stopped performing the role expected of him and simply lived. He helped repair fishing nets. Read stories to village children. Walked beside Eleanor along the shoreline during evenings painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence. Both learned that intimacy was not built through grand declarations alone. It was built through attention, through presence, through choosing day after day to remain. The villagers noticed the change. So did Eleanor. The old Sebastian had carried authority like armor. This man carried humility. The difference transformed everything. One evening they sat overlooking the harbor while lanterns flickered among the fishing boats. I used to believe happiness would arrive after accomplishment, Sebastian admitted. After success. After respect. Eleanor smiled faintly. And did it? No. He looked toward her. It arrived here. Emotion softened her features. Among fishermen and schoolchildren? Beside you. The answer lingered between them. No title could have made it more valuable. No audience could have made it more sincere. For the first time since their marriage began, Eleanor allowed herself to believe he loved her. Not the idea of her. Not the duty of being married to her. Yet even as hope blossomed, another truth quietly advanced beneath the surface. A truth Eleanor had concealed from everyone, including him. The first sign appeared during a walk along the shore. Without warning, dizziness overtook her. She staggered. Sebastian caught her before she fell. Concern immediately darkened his expression. You are unwell. I am merely tired. The explanation sounded unconvincing. Because it was. Over the following days the episodes increased. Fatigue lingered. Her complexion paled. A persistent cough emerged. No matter how she attempted to hide it, Sebastian noticed. At last he summoned a physician from a neighboring town. Eleanor protested. He ignored her objections. For once, his stubbornness proved impossible to overcome. The physician arrived 3 days later. The examination lasted less than an hour. The silence afterward lasted much longer. When Sebastian entered the physician's temporary office, he immediately recognized the expression waiting for him. He had seen it before. Among doctors delivering difficult news to grieving families. What is it? He asked. The physician hesitated. Then spoke gently. She has been ill for some time. A cold sensation spread through Sebastian's chest. How long? Months? Perhaps longer. The room seemed to tilt. Can she recover? The physician's silence provided the answer before words arrived. There are treatments that may ease discomfort. No. Sebastian stepped forward. You misunderstand me. The physician lowered his gaze. I do not. The truth struck with merciless force. While he had been searching for reconciliation, Eleanor had been fighting a battle she never intended him to see. That evening he found her seated beside the sea. The horizon glowed beneath fading sunlight. For a while neither spoke. Then Sebastian sat beside her. You knew. She nodded. Yes. How long? A long while. Pain tightened his voice. Why did you not tell me? Her answer emerged quietly. Because I had already spent too many years asking for things that were not freely given. The words pierced him. Not because they were cruel. Because they were true. He reached for her hand. This time she did not pull away. The months that followed became precious beyond measure. The future they once imagined was no longer guaranteed. Every sunrise mattered. Every conversation mattered. Every shared moment became a treasure. Sebastian remained at her side through everything. When weakness confined her indoors, he read aloud from her favorite novels. When storms rattled the windows, he stayed beside her fire. When fear arrived during sleepless nights, he held her hand until dawn. Love, he discovered, was not proven through possession. It was proven through presence. Winter arrived softly. Snow dusted the cliffs. The sea darkened beneath steel-gray skies. One evening, while firelight danced across the walls of her cottage, Sebastian opened a familiar velvet box. Eleanor immediately recognized it. The sapphire necklace. The gift she had left untouched on the night her world collapsed. For a moment neither spoke. Then he lifted it carefully. The jewels shimmered within the warm glow of the hearth. "You gave me jewels when I needed kindness," she said softly. Regret filled his eyes. "I know." He moved behind her. With gentle hands, he fastened the necklace around her neck. The sapphires rested against her pale skin like fragments of midnight sky. When she turned toward him, tears glistened in both their eyes. "You know," she whispered, "I never stopped loving you." The confession broke something inside him. Not painfully, beautifully. As though every wall he had built throughout his life had finally surrendered. He knelt beside her chair. "And I never truly understood love until I nearly lost it." For a long time they simply remained together. No grand speeches. No dramatic promises. Only truth. Only love. Only the precious awareness that time was becoming increasingly fragile. Several weeks later, as dawn painted the horizon with pale silver light, Eleanor awoke and found Sebastian asleep beside her bed, one hand still wrapped around hers. A tender smile touched her lips. The sight seemed to fill her with peace. When he stirred moments later, she was watching him. "Good morning," he said gently. "Good morning." The words were barely louder than a whisper. Yet they carried extraordinary warmth. She squeezed his hand once. Then looked toward the window where sunlight spilled across the room. "It is beautiful," she murmured. "Yes." His voice trembled. "It is." Eleanor's gaze returned to his face. The face she had loved through loneliness, disappointment, forgiveness, and renewal. The face of the man who had finally learned how to love her back. A peaceful stillness settled over the room. And there, with the first light of morning touching the sapphire necklace at her throat, Eleanor Ashcombe closed her eyes for the final time. Years later, the Duke of Ravensshire never remarried. Society eventually forgot the scandal that had once consumed its attention. New gossip replaced old cruelty. New names occupied newspaper columns. Yet on a windswept cliff above the sea stood a thriving school funded forever in Eleanor's name. Inside its entrance hung her portrait, wearing the sapphire necklace that had come to symbolize not wealth, but redemption. And whenever visitors asked why one of England's most powerful men spent so much time in that small coastal village, the elderly fisherman simply smiled and pointed toward the sea. For some stories, they would say, begin with careless words. But the rarest ones end with a love strong enough to outlive them.